Hi, my name is Arati Ganeshan and I'm a journalist at MediaNama. Today, I'm here with Harish Chengaiah, founder, game director, and producer at Outlier Games, to discuss why the video games industry wants to carve out its own regulatory turf, one that's distinct from online real money gaming. For context, the GST Council recently announced its intent to tax online gaming at par with gambling at 28%. While the government has since clarified that the move only impacts online games involving wagering, like real money games, the move has been painted by some as a body blow to the online gaming industry as a whole. This has once again led to the esports and video games industry asserting itself and making it clear through letters to the government and public comments that it has very little to do with real money gaming and doesn't want to necessarily be lumped with the sector under the broad banner of online gaming. Similar representations were made by the video games and esports industry when the Indian government's online gaming rules were released for public consultation earlier this year. So Harish is here with us today to explain why this is, how this sort of came to be, and how the industry could potentially move forward in this new digital India that we're all living in. So, Harish, the first question I had was essentially about the relationship between the two industries. Now, the online real money gaming industry has been pushing for government recognition for a long time. Even if you look at MediaNama's archives, there have been letters to the government, meetings that have happened with the government about the need for central recognition, of the need for a policy framework, essentially to escape getting banned by states all the time.
Yeah.
My question is, was the esports and video games industry part of those consultations, part of those representations to the government? What is the relationship at a policy level when you're approaching the government between these two industries? Do you work together? Have you always been separate, or is it somewhere in the middle? So just to start off there.
Sure. Uh, Thanks for setting the context first. To answer your question, there was a lot of representation from the RMG and the fantasy sports side before, but the video games and esports industry wasn't a part of it. In fact, the first, I think, out and out representation that we have did was only in January of this year. So before that, we weren't in direct. I mean, some esports entities have gone to distinct themselves away from fantasy sports. So that existed before, and that was also that led to the differentiation of esports being separate and going to Ministry of Youth Affairs and Sports, right? So that representation did happen, but the video game industry as an entity never had such a level of representation done before. So we were away from it. Just to give a policy heads up on why that is globally, when we look at the regulatory landscape, or let's say the bright line, there are two such rules, right? One which says, irrespective of skill or chance, if a game has a monetary payout element, that can never be categorized alongside a game that doesn't have such a payout element. Or it also says things like if there is an element of gambling involved, but that kind of varies from country to country, right? In India, as our Honorable Prime Minister said, that this is an exploratory stage. We are still evolving, right? So I think this confusion with online gaming would be done away with quite soon, is what we hope.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for that. And just to sort of touch upon something that you said, so you mentioned the first time that you'd actually approached the government on a separate note was this year. And I'm guessing that's also how the different ministerial allocations happened and all of that. So the question that I have is the result of a lot of those consultations was the online gaming rules that we had earlier this year. And
Yeah.
at least to me as a journalist, when I read them, they seem to be totally targeted towards real money games. There doesn't
Hmm.
seem to be much of a provision towards video games or esports within them. And I believe that's something that both industries wrote to the government about as well.
Hmm.
So
Sure.
now that we have these regulations in place that are purportedly regulating online gaming in India,
Hmm. Hmm.
how does the industry view them? What sort of concerns did you specifically go to the government with? And do
Sure.
you see those concerns actually resolved in the final product?
Sure. So I'll answer it in two parts. One with what happened with the online gaming rules that came in January, and then the recent GST one. So starting with the online gaming intermediary rules that came out, at that point there was no proper distinction being made. Like if we read through the fine print, the first draft said it applies to online games as a blanket terminology. So that was a grave concern for us because we don't have the staking element, right? We don't have the payout element, so there's no TDS involved. So all such taxational structure and regulatory structure or safety structures does not involve in video games. So things like EKYC or things like depository limits, grievance officer, redressal officer, such things as a weren't even relevant for video games in the first place. It wasn't like a proper one is to one fit for us. So that was the main reason why we wrote to the government saying it had to be divided. And then the last draft that came in, it had this carve out showing online real money games will be having such and such rules. So in that way, it excluded video games entirely from the purview of intermediary rules. So that we thought was a win on our side because we were able to get that kind of a clarity that it would no longer apply to video games. But so keeping that aside, what happened with the GST thing is the GST Council and Department of Revenue is very clear, right? They said it's not applicable for video games, or in their term, it doesn't apply to online games that does not have an element of staking. That's what they've said. So that kind of entirely excludes video games and esports, right? But what needs to be seen from a broader perspective is yes, it is not applying to us, but there are other optics in play. Let's say, for example, this terminology, this excessively broad terminology of online games that is being used, the meaning of that is very, very different when it comes to gamers. When I say gamers, I mean people who play entertainment games. And it is very different anywhere else in the world. Over there, the term online games would only and only refer to a multiplayer game like PUBG, Call of Duty Mobile, Clash of Clans, League of Legends, Dota 2, etc. So online games refers only that. So gamers are utterly confused as to what this 28% GST is. Moreover, the bigger concern is publishers and investors from our side who are outside of India. They don't have this distinction in their hand, in their shorthand, right? And also, if you see the statements that you saw in the last 2 weeks, it perpetrated a homogeneous image that the entire games industry of India is getting affected. And certain even international media outlets were finessed into reporting it like that. Like GameIndustry.biz had an article that we went and clarified, and then they took it down. Apple Insider had an article. So the Western or even the Far Eastern investors and publishers started believing that Indian regulatory system does not make a distinction between real money games and video games, and thus all regulations are similar. That made them hesitate a lot towards investing here or doing co-production or strategic investments. So a large part of it, if you see, whenever you go to media and search for online gaming or online games, you would see an article on RMG or a fantasy sport, but the cover image will be a video game. Like a picture of PS5 would be stuck in the middle, and it doesn't have any connection to the subject matter, right? So there's a lot of like there is this constant push that it is all homogeneous, and that's projecting a very wrong image to the public.
Right. And just a follow-up question to that. So if you say the online gaming rules categorically don't really apply to video games and esports, then what are you like, what regulation, how are you being regulated currently? Are you just kind of existing, or is there actually some pre-existing policy framework that you fall under?
That's a very interesting question. So, so we are kind of a forgotten category at the moment, right? But most of our concerns are on the content side because at the end of the day, video game is a narrative, artistic entertainment medium, right? So we have stories. We tell stories through video games. Everywhere in the world, just like CBFC in India, games have age rating guideline policies as well. In America, they call it ESRB. In European Union, they call it PEGI.
Right.
So Japan has one, Korea has one, Australia has one. India doesn't have one yet.
Hmm.
So I do expect going forward, all it would take is one misstep on a content side, and then we'll be overly scrutinized to moon and beyond.
But how do you define a misstep on the content side? Right.
You do know that the recent controversy surrounding Ulu and certain OTT platforms, right?
Yes, yes.
So such problems should not exist on our side, right? Like for example, India, though India is a bit more liberal than Middle East and China, there are still certain cultural sensitivities that we have, right? So if we have those rules preemptively in the first place, that can set a common stage for everyone that they can go and see, okay, so this is fine, this is not fine. So there are certain places that we should not breach. That makes the whole thing easier, right?
Okay.
Rather than first going through a set of controversies and then trying to scratch our head, figure out, and then come back. So we've been proactively asking the government that let's form an age rating guideline that is in line with global best practices, but having certain cultural sensitivities baked into it.
Right,
So we have proposed a framework that categorizes in five age ranges: 3 and above, 7 and above, 12 and above, 15 and above, 18 and above.
right,
So we say what kind of content, what level of maturity is okay in which tranche, and what can we exclude entirely. Because there'll be certain things that the government won't be too keen, right? Like for example, pornography is a complete no-no. So we video games typically does not have pornography, but obviously in every industry there are some bad actors who are not in the regulatory space, who operate out of island countries or places where there's not a lot of regulation, and they might tend to put a pornographic game.
right. But just to be the devil's advocate, someone could, on the flip side, argue that you're suggesting that creative freedom and expression be curtailed. You're putting these sort of censorship blinkers. So, I mean, what would be your response to that?
Sure, sure. See, I'm a game developer myself, right? I'm a founder of a studio, so before sending it out, I have thought about it 100 times.
Yeah.
So what we have done is, games are a very global medium, right? When a movie releases, they first get it regulated, as in certified in their country, and then they move to every single country one by one to get the age certificate, right? In games industry, that's not the case. There is like a global network of something called IARC, International Age Rating Coalition. So what happens is, any game company from any part of the world can submit their game onto this platform, and it will automatically generate age certificates for every country free of cost immediately.
Hmm.
That kind of a network already exists in video games. So what we have done is, we have seen how different countries does age ratings and how they are mapping it towards IR. So what we have done, we have tried to maintain congruency with what US, North America, or Europe do. So what I'm trying to say is, in video games typically censorship does not exist. It's only content classification. We don't do censorship, right?
Right,
The reason why we don't do it is, editing a game is not as simple as editing a movie. It's an interactive medium, right? So the cost is going to be significantly higher to retweak a game.
right,
And for a country like India, which is just on the rising tide, which is not even there yet, for a publisher from outside of India, if India suddenly says you need to cut this out, you need to edit this out, they would say we would not even release in India then.
right,
So censorship is not there in the age rating guidelines that we have given. We have only said these are the levels of maturity. If so, then put it under this tranche. And we
right.
would self-certify it.
Just so, I mean, we're looking at future impacts that could
Yeah.
impact the industry right now. But just to bring it back to the current discussion, even if you
Yep.
look at the letter that a bunch of gaming studios sent to the Indian government a few days ago about this need for distinction between real money games and video
Yep.
games.
Yep.
One thing that they mentioned over there, and you've touched upon this already, is that it's already clouding global investor sentiments, and that's a real-time impact that's happening now. I'm just sort of curious, can you give us some kind of real life examples or like some kind of insight into how that's working currently? What have
Sure.
investors said? How are
Sure.
investments being impacted?
Sure. Sure. So as I said, what happens is, in outside of India, there's no game of skill, game of chance kind of a regulatory situation, right? So if it is RMG, if it is fantasy sports, it's considered gambling over there.
Hmm.
So the investors and publishers there don't want to be seen alongside such a regulatory system where they are seen together, right? Because some of the investors operate in a country and where they are publicly listed companies, and that's a different sort of a problem that they need to deal with if they're investors to know that in one territory they are being looked at as similar to gambling. So they don't want that, right? So they reached out to certain Indian investments to say what's going on. It's really worrying us. So certain companies joined our consortium because they were kind of like having that pressure to also clarify to their investors. So some of the signees that came on board had that kind of a problem that they need to deal with. So that is one side. In fact, I'll give you another reason. So there are certain companies in India that who use payment gateways, right? Uh, and they have been scrutinized also. Like they are like the payment gateways are saying, uh, what is this 28% GST? Is it like a gambling thing? Like you guys are collecting money, so we don't know what is going on. So we need to like block the payments till we get clarity. So some companies are affecting in that side of an like that side of a effect is also happening, I would say.
Just to bring me back to the last question. So again, we all know a little more about what the real money gaming industry wants from regulation. It's repeatedly said it should be at the central level. it's repeatedly said you should outlaw games of chance, allow games of skill. From the looks of it, there hasn't been much opposition to a self-regulatory structure either. So we have some sort of bearings of what they want. My question is, what does the video games and esports industry want? Is it something radically different? Is it something similar? And I'm also interested to know, do you even view this center versus state issue as something that's relevant for the industry, given that technically here there's no confusion over whether this is gambling or not? So
Yeah,
just curious to know how you think the regulatory thing should be moving forward,
sure,
outside of this sort of content rating and age rating mechanisms that you've already spoken
sure.
about.
Sure. So, yeah, that center versus state does not exist in the video game side of things, right? So we are all of our communication is targeted towards the central government. So what we are looking for from a regulatory standpoint with the central government outside of the age rating mechanisms that we have thought is we are also looking to form an SRO, a video games industry specific SRO, which we are thinking hopefully should get recognized by the government of India, right? So we have certain other regulatory aspects that we need to look for, like data protection is a big part of it, right? Because video games does have a data element to it. Like we do collect some data. Most of the time, it's not even data that the video game companies collect, but the platform holder. When I say platform holder, I'm talking like PlayStation Store, Google Play, App Store, etc., etc. So they have certain basic level data that they collect, right? Like the user's email ID, name, geographic area, things like that. So in DIA, Digital India Act, it is still under the broad category of online games. So there is not enough nuance going into it. So there are some specific nuances as far as data protection goes or data regulation goes that are very specific towards video games. So we want to bring light towards that for the central government and say this is how it operates in the Indian gaming industry or in the global gaming industry. These are the kind of best case practices that we have in terms of how we regulate data. So can we also please look at that and have bespoke regulations and try to get it inculcated, included within the DIA? Otherwise, that's going to be a problem that we need to keep talking and keep making representation, and they'll take its own sweet own time, right? So there is a data angle one side. The other angle that we are also interested outside of age rating and the data angle is we are constantly in touch trying to get a audience on the ABGC XR policy. So interestingly, I'll tell you another hindrance that we have had. So when you take a look at the AVGC XR policy, the amount of support that it has for animation visual effects is insane.
Yeah,
But
there's
then when I was,
almost entire chapters just allocated to it if you look at it.
yeah,
Yeah,
but not for games much.
right.
So when I spoke to the committee, here's the interesting answer they had. They are like, we have no consensus over what gaming in India is. They're
Okay.
like, some people are claiming that they are fantasy sports, esports. Some people are claiming they are video games. We don't even understand what's going on in that place. So we didn't want to like set up too much. We
Okay.
thought some thought leader from your end will come and clarify everything. So
Okay.
then we started making a very elaborate representation. We are going to talk somewhere in September, a 50-pager, which says here's a definition for video games, which is wrote in a way that RMG and fantasy sports cannot get themselves categorized under. So could you please look into categorizing it under AVGC XR policy and then look into building around it within the AVGC policy that you have prepared. So
Right.
that is another thing that we are looking at. So SRO structure was another thing, like what kind of people do we need to include? We have given it a very fair thought. We need, like who and all should be involved in it to maintain transparency, to maintain fairness,
Right.
both towards the public as well as the industry.
Right. Understood. And I just have two final questions before we bring this to a close. The first is one thing that the online real money gaming industry has really had to fight off is this question of addiction and gaming related suicides,
Sure.
financial losses, and Tamil Nadu especially has faced this a lot. Uh, Is that question of addiction, or is it also relevant to the video games and esports industry? And the reason I ask this is in India, the conversation might be unique to a single sector, but we've seen across the world that a lot of the times gaming addiction, they're actually talking about video game addiction or negative cultural influences, for example. So is that something that you, as an industry, started thinking about in terms of consumer welfare?
Sure, sure. I'm very glad you asked the first question because that was another thing that I forgot to mention.
Okay.
So, what happens in the video games industry is we put a lot of there's this GDPR and end user license agreement, right?
Yes.
This and also the child COPA in USA. So
Yes.
these things have globally pushed the video games industry to be very, very proactive in terms of certain user harm areas, right? So what happens if you go into any gaming platform, doesn't matter whether it's PlayStation, Xbox, Nintendo, PC, smartphones, there are extremely robust set of features that already exist.
Hmm.
It can control things like how long can my child play a game on a weekly basis, monthly basis, or a daily basis, and how much of money can they even put into in-app purchases,
Right.
and can I even block it for a while,
Right.
and what kind of age-rated games can they have access to, and many things. Every concern that a parent or a government can potentially have from the perspective of video games towards their kids or people below 18 years of old,
Hmm.
there are already robust set of features that are already baked into every single platform, and
Hmm.
all that a parent has to do is pick up this family app which is available on all of those platforms, connect it to the account on that particular device, whether it be PC, console, or mobile, and they
Hmm.
can monitor every single thing. When I say every single thing, I'm saying what games they're playing, for how long, did they put any money towards that game, and the money is kind of like a prepaid. Like parent will put it under that pocket, under the digital pocket, and the kids can use it. So kids
Hmm.
cannot themselves go and swipe a card.
Right. Right.
So such systems are already in place. So what we have asked the government is, while we cannot take an extreme measure like China, which says people can only arbitrarily play for 2 hours a week, mostly on Saturday, Sunday, we can't do that. We are a democracy, right?
Okay.
So what we can instead do is we can use PIB, the government's press release network,
British Bureau.
uh,
Yeah.
to to say that such do's and don'ts and best practices are there. There are family apps, there are parental controls, raise awareness and digital literacy on such systems,
Okay.
and we can run an EEC campaign. That is another ask that we have, because PIB did do this back in 2021. They said there are such mechanisms that are existing in gaming platforms, specifically towards games like video games,
Hmm.
and you as a parent or a guardian can look into such parental control features. They
Hmm.
did do it in the winter of 2021. So what we are now saying is, let's restart it, but think about it from a perspective, broader perspective of an EEC campaign.
Right.
So parents should be aware that there are rating system, and if your kid does not play a game that is not for their age level, they are safe. If they do, then obviously it is a similar situation of them looking at an A certified movie.
And finally, just on the timeline, so I mean, there seems to be a sudden sort of need to come together as an industry and approach the government. So, what timelines are you looking at? When can we start expecting action?
Sure. So the letter that we have sent out, we don't expect to hear immediately because the central government has other problems to deal with at the moment.
Currently?
uh, as all of us are aware, there are multiple problems from all different directions.
Yes.
So we don't expect to hear anything in the monsoon season. But winter session is something that we are really looking forward to. That's when we think we'll be getting our answers. In
Hmm.
fact, we are trying to schedule the AVGC discussion in the month of September, the first half of September.
Right.
So the AVGC XR would be in September, the discussions that we will have in Delhi. As far as what we have asked for at the moment with uh, the ask to get video games segregated, that would have to wait till winter session is what we're thinking.
Okay. Okay, great. So thank you so much, Harish, for taking out the time to speak with us. If you'd like to listen or like read more of Harish's thoughts, he seems to be very active on LinkedIn, which is how I first came across his work. So do follow him there and learn more about his perspective for the industry. If you'd like to read more of MediaNama's coverage on online gaming, video games, and esports, do head over to our website. We have years worth of coverage on this issue. Thank you so much, Harish, for speaking with me today.
Thank you.